Go. Cool. So welcome everyone. This is the second event in our Twitter Istanbul developers community events. We're not just trying to become, a Turkey Istanbul thing. We think Istanbul is kind of like the commercial center of a very wide range of geography around Turkey. We also like to think that when it comes to data science, computational social science, or Twitter research, we'd like to think of Istanbul as a base of a larger area of geography. So we don't only have Turks here, we have people from all around the place. This is our second event. The first one, we unfortunately did not record it. We should have, from this point onwards, I'm thinking about recording them because the first one was also quite useful. But today, we really have a huge star in Twitter analysis, Marc Owen Jones. I've been meaning to get him to Istanbul. At one occasion, I succeeded, but he was part of larger conference, but a conference dedicated to him, where we can do an extended tutorial on doing network analysis with Twitter data. Hopefully in the future, we can bring him here physically and do this physically as well. But for now, we are doing this on Zoom. So I'm assuming that people who are here already know Marc, but let me introduce him very briefly. Marc Owen Jones is an assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, where he lectures and researches on political repression and informational control strategies. His recent work has focused on the way social media has been used to spread disinformation and fake news in the Middle East. If you're a Twitter user, 90% chance you came across one of his very interesting Twitter network analysis that basically showed propaganda dynamics, disinformation, counter-disinformation dynamics. In March 2019, he published The Gulf Information War, Propaganda, Fake News, and Fake Trends in the International Journal of Communication. His upcoming book, I think this is not an upcoming book, it's published already, Disinformation and Deception in the Middle East, or is it?
It's imminent, so it's
okay.
I literally have been sent the final proofs, which I thought was the last one. So it should be out in the next 2 weeks.
Fingers crossed. So he has Disinformation and Deception in the Middle East, coming from Hearst Books and Oxford University Press. He has a published monograph called Political Repression in Bahrain, which was published in July 2020 from Cambridge University Press. He has won multiple awards for his work. His PhD thesis in Government and International Affairs from Durham University won 2016 Best Thesis Award from the Association for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies. In 2021, he won the UK Alumni Professional Achievement Award from the British Council in Qatar. Through the course of his career, he has won several awards for teaching both at Exeter University and Hamad bin Khalifa University. He's the editor of numerous books on Bahrain and the Gulf, including Gulfization of the Arab World, published in 2018 by, how do you pronounce this? Gerlach Press? I assume it's German, right?
I don't know. I don't want to offend any German speakers here. I think it's, I just say Gerlach.
Okay, cool. So basically, he specializes in providing timely analysis on disinformation campaigns, and has taken an active role in numerous high-profile investigations. So he's a scholar, he's a scientist, but he also contributes to actual investigations of these events in real time. So he's actually a practitioner / advisor practitioner. So basically, I am going to shut up now and basically give the floor to Marc, but maybe last word. We're very lucky to have you here, Marc. Thanks so much for doing this. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really nice to be here. Nice to see you all here. Thank you for coming too. I know people are Zoom fatigued. I apologize for my hair and beard, but my barber is out of town. So I'm just kind of letting it do its thing. So today it's kind of a first. I mean, I've done a few workshops on network analysis in different contexts, usually with a bit more time. That most of you have some degree of technical knowledge and methods, but also to reassure you of those who don't maybe feel so confident. I'm not like a coder by background. You know, my background is very much qualitative, journalism, media studies, history, political science, and I've kind of self-taught myself. So I see myself as more of a kind of computational social science who. That's why I end up doing a lot of this political analysis, which is one of the reasons I think I was invited. Instead of just looking at the data, I try and give the data a bit of a story, which I think is important in the world we're living in. So that's kind of my thing. So today what I'm going to do, I will probably be assuming some knowledge, but afterwards, if anyone has any questions, no matter how simple or basic they think they are, then please feel free to ask me. Similarly, if they're very complicated, I'll pass those questions on to someone else. But we'll wait to the end. So what I'm going to do today is actually run through a couple of case studies that I've worked on in network analysis. So we're going to go through it, really, just, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing, because I sometimes think this is the best way to through things. And because it's being recorded, then I think it will give you the opportunity to go through it again if you're interested, and maybe sort of try and replicate some of the steps. And if in 1 second, I'm happy to share the data as well, so people can play around with it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So most of you probably heard of Gephi, which is a free network analysis tool that has actually just been updated. There was much talk about it wasn't going to be updated, but they recently updated a new version. And Gephi is great. It's really flexible. Allows you to do computer hardware permitting analysis of really large networks. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to import, and we can discuss again importing data at the end. But just in this particular context, I gathered the Twitter data using NodeXL. But I have other ways of gathering data. You can actually gather it through Gephi itself, through a plugin, which is pretty easy to set up if you have API code. But I also, as an academic, have API access to Twitter data. And so I can download historic data for them, because NodeXL, for example, only gives you data from the streaming API, which is usually limited to about 10 days history. But what you can do actually with the API data from Twitter, if you have access, is create network, what you call them edge lists. So you can actually create network graphs from that data, which I've been doing recently and experimenting with, and maybe that would be interesting for a subsequent workshop or something down the line, because it would take more time to explain. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open a file, and I'll explain what it is in a second. So the first one is called Facebook Caliphate. Now, this was a hashtag that trended back in 2020. So I'm going to import this. It's a directed graph. I won't explain necessarily what that is right now, but you can ask. Some of you may already know. So I import that data, which again, I gathered this data from NodeXL, and I just exported it using simple export function. And then you get this black blodgy mess, which is the raw data here. So just, if some people are a bit unfamiliar with what network graphs are, I'll give a quick explanation in a second. But broadly speaking, I'm dragging a little dot out here. In the case of Twitter, in a network graph, forgive me if this is simple, this is a node. That circular thing is a node. And in Twitter, that can represent different things, but for the most part, it represents an individual tweet, okay? The line, the edge, these 3 lines are relationships. This can be a retweet, it can be a reply, it can be a mention. So basically, any network graph at its very simple level is a connection between 2 nodes with a line, an edge. Well, usually 3, I suppose. I don't know if 2 makes a network. I'm not sure what the technicalities are there. But you can make network graphs with anything. It doesn't have to be Twitter data. You know, you have historians making interesting network analysis of, for example, letters sent between people in the 1800s, right? When did the king of X send a letter to the king of Y? And, you know, they draw like a node for that king. And then you get these big network graphs to show influence networks across history, which is also fascinating. But we're just applying this to Twitter. So what you can see here already is that this is a connection of about 10,000 different nodes. So 10,000 different tweets from specific users. And what we can tell Gephi to do, I mean, Gephi essentially is a statistical processing software. We can tell it to make certain calculations which are important. So at this very basic level, if I draw out this node here, you can see that there's 2 edges, which means 2 forms of interaction. And this will determine the degree. So what you can do with Gephi is you can tell it to calculate how many nodes there are and how many different edges they have, or how many degrees they have. And then you can, for example, size the graph according to those edges. And this, very crudely speaking, allows us to determine who is the most vocal in the community, or who is the most influential, who doesn't say much, that kind of thing. So degree is essentially a measure of gregariousness or communicativeness within a network. But first, in order to do this, we just have to run a few basic steps. If you look on the right, there's a statistics column, and this gives us opportunities to do various things. So I'm going to run a few statistics, and I'll explain what they are. It's average degree. This will just count all the different edges connected to each node within that. I'm going to go down a bit, and here you'll see community detection. Now, this is interesting because obviously when you have a group or a network of people interacting, you can calculate based on who those different nodes are interacting with, the emergence of various forms of communities within that, because some people will communicate more with other people and some will communicate with less with other people. So when you process this on a larger scale, you can actually detect specific communities. Now, bear in mind, if we're talking about a hashtag, these hashtags are temporally defined, so it's not necessarily going to be indicative of an offline community as such, but they can give us insights into how people behave. This is a temporally bound hashtag community, and that communities are essentially based on who is talking at that time on that particular hashtag. So I'll run that. Just click OK. Doesn't take long. The nice thing about Gephi, by the way, is that when you do any of these calculations, it gives you a little bibliography or reference to, if you want to explore more and to go into the weeds of the data on that. I'll also run eigenvector centrality, which is another measure of influence of the network. Some people, when they're calculating clout or influence of the network, will use eigenvector centrality as a form of measurement. It just basically calculates the perceived influence of a node within a network in relation to other nodes. So broadly speaking, that will be your influencer, although there are other measures of influence, but we're not going to get into that. So I've made these calculations. Now I want to make the graph more readable. So just before I do that, I just want to tell you a bit about this story. So the hashtag that I analyzed was called Facebook Caliphate. Now, if you remember back in 2020, I think it was 2020, Facebook created a oversight board, an oversight committee. The idea was to try to make Facebook more public orientated and accountable when it came to take down content decisions. So they created a board, I think, of 20 people who would be basically their council to oversee who could take down information on Twitter. So it was made up of very kind of ex-diplomats, ex-politicians, journalists, and in one case, Tawakkol Karman, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Tawakkol Karman is a Yemeni activist, and many people in the Gulf accuse her of having links to the Muslim Brotherhood. And in the context of particularly 2017 onwards, there has been a kind of resurgent attempt, mostly by the UAE and Saudi, to try and contain what they see as Muslim Brotherhood influence. So there was anger that Tawakkol Karman was appointed to the Facebook Council. The hashtag Facebook Caliphate was a means of trying to express that Facebook would somehow now become a tool used by the Muslim Brotherhood to, I don't know, undermine the world order. I mean, you know, these conspiracy theories are something else. Anyway, it was an interesting hashtag, and when I looked at it, I thought it would be an interesting one to analyze. And it turns out it does show some characteristics that I think are interesting to show you in terms of how to look for manipulation in network analysis. So next, I'm going to now give the background of that. If you go into the left here, we have a layout section. The layout section gives us a selection of algorithms that will separate out the graph in various different ways. Now, you can experiment with this. This is part of the fun. But most of the time when I do my analysis, I use Force Atlas 2. This just spreads the graph out generally in a readable way, but we'll make a few edits along the way to make it even more readable. So once you select the particular algorithm you want, you click Run, and this is where the fun bit comes, because for a second it looks pretty cool. Just click Run, see things happening. So you might have noticed all these little things shooting off. These are usually accounts that have not been when the data has been collected, been connected to anyone by a reply or a relationship, you know. But what you usually end up with is something like this, which again is a network graph. And you can see it's quite dense. What I would recommend if you're interested in doing this and using Force Atlas 2, once you've expanded it like this, if you look on the left, there is a checkbox called Prevent Overlap. Now, Prevent Overlap just stops the nodes overlapping. So when I click it, you'll see them spreading out. This gives a bit more separation to make it more readable. So I'm just going to click that now. So as you can see now, it just spreads out a little bit. So that means we can see that all the accounts that are involved. So now we still have a graph that's not particularly readable. I mean, it's just a bunch of nodes and edges. So what we can start to do is to add labels, to change the size of various nodes in order to allow it to tell us something, okay? So a usual good first port of call is to size the network according to influential accounts. That way, if you're interested, someone says to you, your boss, you know, I don't know, you're working for the CIA and your boss says, hey, you know, can you tell us who's the big shots online? You're like, yeah, sure, let me just do this. So what we do, we go over to the left, and if you look, we've got some tabs here. We've got nodes, we've got edges. So we want to be on the nodes, and you can see on the right here, we've got a little paint palette. We don't want to use that yet, and we've got this sizing node. So we click on that, click on ranking, and choose attribute. And remember, I said now we want it to size the nodes according to who's the most influential. So I'll go to eigenvector centrality, which is that influence measure that I mentioned earlier. And you want a bit of distinction between your minimum size node and your maximum size node, otherwise it doesn't make much difference to the layout. I usually start with something like 60 or 70. So we'll say the max size, the largest, the most influential node will be 70. I'll click that and then I'll click apply. So you can see already the graph has kind of shifted a little. Some things have contracted, and we can see, if I highlight them, some larger nodes are emerging here. So that's one thing. I think now it'd be useful to add a little color. So you could color these according to what data you have. And this is the important thing to remember when you're doing network analysis. Obviously, the adage garbage in, garbage out applies, but it's not just about garbage in, garbage out. It's about what data you have. So if you're using specific software to import the data like Node Excel, there's a predetermined set of metadata that you will be given. If you download it from Twitter's API, you can actually be more selective in what you choose to include and what you choose not to include. But Node Excel provides you quite a lot of interesting kind of data in terms of what's included. We'll come a bit to that. But what I want to do first is just, and this is quite useful if you're doing political analysis, is when you look at these network analyses, and what you notice over time is that the community detection algorithm that I highlighted does often highlight interesting groups of people, because often on Twitter, when people are discussing a certain thing, they will interact with people in specific ways, either through agreement or disagreement. But often what you find out, if you identify the communities and then further examine those communities, you find common elements of those communities that can be quite interesting. So firstly, what I'll do, I'll just go to modularity class, which remember was the community detection algorithm. Incidentally, Gephi have also included something called statistical inference, which is another community detection algorithm, which I gather is more accurate. In practice, I think it's a kind of a marginal difference. So you can see now on the left, I've highlighted modularity class, and you've got all these numbers. These numbers are just the numbers of the particular communities. I've just gone to palette there, so we don't want them all grayed out. And when I click apply, you'll see that Gephi has, based on its calculations, identified particular communities, and now I've assigned them a color. And you can actually customize this as much as you want. So if you don't like that particular shade of blue, you can change it. And you know, if you want to make beautiful graphs, which I'm sure we all do, then you can color coordinate to your heart's content. But you know, that will be in the aesthetics of Gephi presentation workshops. Just incidentally as well, some might prefer high contrast, click for black. It depends what you prefer to work with. I'm going to use that for now because I generally find it easier to use. So what we have now is the identified communities. This is already showing us a few things interesting. We've got accounts sized by influence. And it would be useful here just to have a few names on it. So if you look at the bottom here, there's a T sign here. I'll click that. That will show node labels. They're a bit big, so I'll just reduce them. It's already a bit chaotic. But if we zoom in, for example, we can just see that we can see the accounts. So Facebook here, why is that big? Usually that means people are actually just mentioning Facebook. And that's what happened in this case. You know, when you look at this data, you can't assume things. It's very easy to assume, oh, look, Facebook's big. I go back to maybe it's tweeting a lot about this topic. Clearly, Facebook is not tweeting about the topic, Facebook Caliphate. So if you click and actually, you have to do this in conjunction with looking at Twitter itself to verify what you're actually looking at. You know, you can only infer so much from the images. And, you know, that's people mentioning Facebook. And, you know, these are the accounts, mostly Saudi-based accounts. I mean, obviously, I've looked at this data, who are general influences on this. So, you know, this is a sort of classic graph where you can explore. You could then look further at those accounts. Who are they? Who are they connected to? Why are they talking about this particular topic? I know from my own experience over time that these are very familiar influences who tend to come up anytime when there's an issue of national importance. Now, what I think is interesting here, some of you have may have noticed, this kind of unusual situation we've got going in the northeastern corner or top right. We've got this kind of densely clustered collection of different accounts here, which, you know, after some analysis appears to be a bunch of Saudi influencers interacting and condemning the selection of Tawakkul Karman on the Facebook Caliphate. And then you've got this community here, which is less densely connected to the major one, right? And just to show you, again, give an example of how the modularity and community section will work. If I go to modularity class again and recalculate, you actually have the ability to change the threshold of the sensitivities of how Gephi interprets those community connections, right? And you might want to do this for aesthetic reasons or to see how it kind of interprets the data. So you just change the resolution. So if I increase the resolution, it's going to be less parsimonious in how it determines those groups. So I'll click 2, then it does that. And then I have to recalculate. I'm just making a point here. The colors have changed, but what you'll notice, for example, the community that we identified here, the top right one, has now become one community. So Gephi has basically seen that there is sufficient similarities between these two communities that separate it from these, but also combine the two together. So it can be an interesting test. So we have this. So in theory, we've identified this as separate, which in itself could be nothing. It just could be some people have picked up on this Facebook Caliphate hashtag, they think it's interesting and just want to tweet about it, but they're not particularly associated with the Saudi network, possible. There's a few other things that I think are useful to do then when we look at these type of networks. Obviously, you can look at them, but the beauty of network analysis is obviously that we can see a lot of information in a short amount of time that allows us to make informed analysis. And that's the benefit really of it. So what I want to do here is actually, and these are techniques that I've sort of learned over time just by examining data to find things. So, you know, hopefully sparing you some of the experimentation, although please experiment, because you will find new things and you will be the next generation of network analysis. So let's look at the edges between these accounts, because when I said we look at the Twitter data that we've imported, and this is when the quality of the data comes in, we can explore the edges. So remember, the edges of the relationship between the nodes. In this case, because it's a Twitter map, edges usually mean a tweet, a reply, a mention, a retweet. There's specific relationships within the Twitter ecosystem. So if I go back onto the tab on the left and we see edges and partition, we can color the edges according to the data that we have. So just as an interesting example, you can see here on the left, we've got different categories. We've got relationship. So relationship is the one I mentioned. This is, as you can see, this defines whether the tweet is a retweet, a tweet, a mention, a retweet, a mention, or reply. So now I'm going to color the edges in this network according to the relationship category. So I'll click apply. So what you'll notice immediately is that pink is retweet. And this is something that holds true throughout many Twitter conversations. And it's another interesting aspect of Twitter. I have a colleague who wrote a paper about it in the Middle East. It would suggest that because most conversations are retweets, Twitter is mostly people just, you know, not potentially agreeing with someone else, but amplifying the voice of a smaller amount of people. So it's quite top-down and hierarchical. So this doesn't tell us a great deal, but it does tell us that 75% of the relationships in this network are retweets, right? 11% are actual individual tweets. But you will find on most hashtags it's retweets, so just amplification. What can be useful here, though, because this might tell us nothing, but I'm going to go through another example where actually this measure of relationship is actually more of a smoking gun. So every data set is different because how networks use, and if there's influence campaigns, they adopt different techniques. But what I'm going to try, another useful one, is source. So source is the application from which the tweet was sent. As you know, lots of us use Android systems or maybe the iPhone, but also people will send tweets from computers, TweetDeck. There's a number of different applications that you can send tweets from. Although this has got a lot smaller over time since Twitter have changed the API. Back in the day, there used to be hundreds of God knows how many dodgy applications. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recolor the network. And generally what we'd expect, what we tend to see is the majority of tweets in most networks I've looked at, and I've looked at networks across the world, are sent from either Twitter for Android, Twitter for iPhone, Twitter web client, which is just your browser, sometimes TweetDeck. And people who've studied Facebook data can also make inferences. Sometimes you'll see higher proportions of Twitter, iPhone than Android, especially in richer countries where iPhones tend to be more expensive. So you can, you can make sort of very, very, very cautious kind of interpretations based on that. Anyway, I'll click apply, and suddenly we see something quite interesting. So if we're looking at the main mass here of the Saudi accounts, broadly speaking, you can see a big meshing of iPhone and Android. With a few Twitter web apps. If you look at the data on the left, we can see that 52% of the edges are Twitter for iPhone, there's 28% Android, 70% are Twitter web app. But then if we go to our separate community here, what we see is that all the accounts interacting here are light blue, which is Twitter web app. So not only do we have a separate community here, we have a community that is retweeting a few other accounts, but all those accounts, and I'm not going to go into it now, we could export this particular community based on the modularity statistic. They are all using the same application. Now, this is anomalous usually, right? If you have a few thousand accounts within a network, all tweeting on the same hashtag, all using the same particular application, again, that's an important red flag to look at. This tells us that that community is suspicious. And sure enough, when you actually look in detail at that community, it is largely probably automated accounts who are retweeting a few central accounts. Most of these accounts have subsequently been suspended. So that's how, in one level, you can just quickly determine, by creating a network graph, how to isolate potentially suspicious clusters and then color their interactions to find anomalies. And just in terms of the functionality of Gephi, if you're interested in, say, this fake account here, Tyler Q1, sounds just very unconvincing already. If I right-click on it, well, firstly, so Gephi allows you to look at the spreadsheet of the data, but I can just click select in data laboratory. I go up to the top left and I click data laboratory, and I can instantly get a read on the details of that particular account. And obviously, if you're interested, say, in this cluster or this particular community, you can go to your data laboratory and export the data, and then just have the spreadsheet and sort by that particular community. And then you're just interested in exploring that further, it allows you to just hone in on those particular groups. So that's one example that I wanted to walk through. And I'm happy to answer questions on that later. But I just want to walk through another example now to make some other points about how these networks might work. So I'm going to open this file. So this is a smaller network, 3,729 nodes and a lot of edges. Again, we always end up with the same thing to start with. So this is an interesting one. This is hashtag is called, it's a combination of different hashtags. Where is Noof and Qatar killed Noof. So just to give you some background, at the end of several years ago, a Qatari woman claimed asylum in the UK because she claimed her parents were abusing her, and obviously she couldn't seek justice within Qatar, so she fled. And then at the end of last year, she returned to Qatar, and then was incommunicado for some time, provoking fears that something had happened to her or that her family had killed her. Turns out that she was in a hospital recovering. But there was a lot of media coverage and media attention, and the hashtag "Where is Noof?" and "Qatar killed Noof" were trending. And I thought it was an interesting case because I saw a number of local influencers who are usually very vocal on Gulf affairs tweeting about this and condemning Qatar. So it's, again, there was a few flags that got my interest. So I'm going to do the same things as I did before, just to run this point home. I'm going to run the degree measures. I'm going to run modularity, and I'm going to run eigenvector centrality. And then, as I did before, I'm going to resize the nodes based on, let's say, eigenvector centrality. Or let's do a different one. What you'll find in degree is one. So in degree, you'll find is often similar to eigenvector. In degree is just usually in a Twitter graph, it's an indication of who has retweeted the most and who has the most incoming traffic. But we'll just use that for now. But often it ends up looking the same as eigenvector or similar. I'll apply. We can see that it's resized. And then I will use Force Atlas to expand that. Again, we have here, and then I'll go to prevent overlap to, again, spread our accounts out a little more. And then I'm going to color, again, by community. This is just my pipeline. I mean, it's something I've acquired, and it allows you to give a good read on what's going on. So I'll color by modularity, so that's community. So you can see there's lots going on here. Prevent overlap, yeah, and so I'll put the names of the accounts on. What I tend to do as well, I'll put it black because I think it's a bit easier. Once you've created a sort of rough shape that you like, it's useful if you go back to your layout algorithms and click expansion. I tend to do this, and then I just expand it a few times to spread out the accounts. So it allows you to look in a bit, maybe thicken the edges just for the purpose of this. And then get those names on. I'm not going into the aesthetics of things so far. This is just kind of more pragmatics. So what we have here is, where do you start with a graph like this? We've got, we can see again who are the influencers, or at least who is being mentioned a lot. Al Jazeera Arabic, Tamim bin Hamid, who's the ruler of Qatar. This kind of account, I don't know who that is. These are all accounts I don't know, but Lina Al-Hathlul is a Saudi activist. You can see there's inward arrows here, which means she's being mentioned. So people you'd expect to be mentioned, I suppose, on a hashtag that's about a disappeared activist. You have activists being mentioned, and you have government officials in Qatar being mentioned. So that all makes sense. To member of the Foreign Ministry. So let's, for example, apply some of our coloration methods just to give us an idea of what's going on. So remember what we did before was look at relationship. So when you do this a lot, you start to expect things, right? So if I was to look, some of you might have noticed these kind of fan shapes we have on the edge. We've got a fan here. When I say fan, it means, like you see one account with loads of accounts attached to it. There's quite a few of these, if you notice. Or there's another one here. Normally, when you see Twitter networks, you'd expect this to be a case of someone has tweeted and a lot of people have retweeted them. That's the normal thing you'd expect when you see that shape. However, it's very interesting here. If I press apply, if we look here, retweet is purple, reply is green. So all those little fan shapes that we might have thought were retweets are actually replies. And which is unusual. Again, unusual based on the fact that experience has shown that it's usually retweets, right? So what we see here is that all these accounts here are actually replying to these accounts, which in the face of it might make sense, because if you have people who are active or concerned, for example, about a missing person, they might reply to influential people like the Ministry of Interior Qatar to raise a particular instance. But what this also would indicate is that these people who are replying based on the data we have are also not interacting with anyone else in the network. They seem to solely exist to reply to those things. So let's just look again at the source. What application were they sending those tweets from, for example? Click apply, zoom out again. Now we found all those little fan shapes that were also replying are also being sent from the same application. See, we have all these are green, which means they're being sent, in this case, from Twitter web app, which again is highly suspicious, right? So now what we do is start to look at those accounts, either individually or in bulk, to see what they tell us. And obviously I've done this, but just to show you, let's do this. Let's grab one of these. Let's get this guy. So Said Halil 4. I'll just have to reshare my browser. Can you see my browser? Yeah? Okay, great, thanks. That's the right spelling. You've got to be careful you get the names right. No, see, I spelled that wrong already. So this is the account that I just picked out. I've never actually looked at this particular account before, but I can guarantee this is a reply. So yeah, we see here, this tweet is the tweet that would have been picked up. And when you actually look at all these accounts, so it's a reply saying Nuf al-Mu'adid, who's the girl who was missing. And you can grab another one. Yeah. I'm not going to do that one. Okay, let's go with this. And some of these names are already just suspicious, right? Type another one in. And sorry, wrong one. Yeah, and so it's another situation. And actually, when you go through all these, you find out they're all pretty much using a picture and not really writing anything, but including a hashtag. Using the same application, the same technique. And what's really interesting about these accounts is that what they've done, and this was a particular thing that confused me at first, is it's why it's useful to look through all of them. You go through their history, and all these tweets, again, crudely speaking, are tweeting well-known and established public officials in Qatar. And if you will look at the timeline generally of these tweets accounts, you would see that they're pro-Qatar, right? Which is really interesting, and it got me thinking, what's going on here? Because these are obviously all fake accounts, but they're all talking about this Nuf al-Mahdi, they're being critical of government. And obviously there's people here who are critical of government. This is clearly an influence campaign. And what it occurred to me is that what they'd done when they set up these accounts is that whoever had set them up had then, in order to populate the accounts and give them an illusion of credibility, had gone through loads of old tweets from Qatari influencers and pro-Qatar people and retweeted old tweets. So actually their timeline was full of old retweets from Qatar that they'd done on bulk. You go through it, it's all the same people they're retweeting. And then they'd explicitly just been used for this Nuf campaign, right? And what's interesting about all this particular network, I mean, I haven't done a thread on this, so they're all still, they're there, the accounts are there, they haven't been active in ages, but they haven't been deleted or suspended. So it's quite an interesting case to actually explore further. But yeah, that's the kind of thing I wanted to talk about and just give a few examples, because I was conscious of time and I wanted to give people the opportunities to answer questions or ask questions, and happy to show any other things and give some other examples. I have some PowerPoint slides that might be useful. But I think I'll stop it there for now and just open the floor to questions. And thanks again for listening.
Thank you so much. This was really great. So We are opening the floor to questions for those of you who can just raise your hand. If you're shy, you can type your question into the chat box and I can point them to Marc. I'll just start abusing my position as the host of this meeting. So I've been thinking a lot about dynamic graphs of Twitter events. Every network that we do, it gets like a snapshot of events. Like, how do you think should we go about creating those dynamic network graphs? Like, get continuous stream of tweets and then put them into like Node.xl and then feed this into Gephi one way or another indefinitely, because myself and this crowd, we are more familiar with R. We don't really know much about Gephi. So like, how would you go about creating dynamic graphs of an event, let's say for an hour?
Well, I mean, you can, depends on the functionality using. So Gephi has a dynamic functionality. All you need to do, and again, it depends how you import the data. So if you use the Twitter streaming importer, which is a plugin for Gephi, it will import the tweets, and then you can literally press play, and it will give you a dynamic graph that populates over time. So that will do that with using the importer. Sometimes when you import data from outside Gephi, you just have to make sure that you supply, I think it has to be a string for it to be understood by Gephi. So you can do that, but you might have to manually edit it if you're getting it from Twitter's API or other sources. But the importing plugin does have that, and it is a useful functionality. And I honestly think there needs to be some sort of bespoke software solution for real-time streaming of this and identification of things like this. I mean, we know there's Hoaxy, which gives you a little bit of that. But Hoax is interesting because I've seen it before, but I was just looking at what it determined was a bot. And a lot of the bot accounts were just verified news accounts because they tweet a lot. I presume that's why they were registering as a bot, right? So it's not that useful. But I would think there's a bespoke software solution is needed. I think Gephi is good for giving a snapshot over time. But the ideal would be just to have an interface that you'd have in real time. You just click on it, put in a hashtag in, it will sort of show you what's going on at that time, and then highlight particular clusters of note based on many of the different methods we've seen for detecting anomalies.
Yeah. So if we have any like developers or Python experts in this crowd, see that our community is quite interested in one of you developing maybe like a dynamic network integrator for Twitter data, that would be hugely useful. But it's a very technical thing. So who wants to go first in terms of questions? So let's open this up for some questions.
I'm just letting the cat outside.
Yeah, sure.
I think Gizem has a question.
Yes, my question is not directly related to network analysis. There's a different level of repression among these countries, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar are different in terms of repression on the internet. How should we evaluate these differences in our analysis?
Differences in repression, online repression?
Yes.
I mean, it's a broad question. What I think is some indicative if we have to accept that these states allow the use of social media, but it's my belief that if they didn't feel that they could control social media, they wouldn't allow it to be used, right? So what strategies exist, as you say, that highlight repression, and how can we demonstrate that? Well, there's many different factors. We know, for example, Saudi have infiltrated Twitter, and they use trolls and bot accounts, although it's impossible to find a smoking gun. I think for me, the most interesting thing that we can track over time in a concrete way is to actually, I call them disinfluencers. What you find in the Gulf states is that, of course, the official media narrative is amplified through social media networks, right? What I tend to find, especially in Saudi Twitter, which makes more sense because Saudi is the most populous Twitter user in the Middle East, in Arabic language anyway, in the Middle East, depending on how you define the Middle East, is looking at influencers who constantly over time are the most influential over time, and what they are tweeting about. Because what you tend to find whenever there's some sort of political crisis or political event, the conversation of that is dominated by a select group of people. And I could even name these people when it comes to Saudi. So all that it means is Twitter is becoming a tool of amplification for a specific group of pro-regime influencers. And I think, this is a way of, it's not necessarily analyzing repression more as it is analyzing propaganda, but it's all part of the same kind of thing, because the issue, I suppose, with Twitter is that so many of the voices who would challenge authorities have been intimidated into silence. So they don't tweet. So there's a vacuum there that's then filled with these pro-regime voices. So I think that's one way to look at it. But you could also look at dissent. If you could look at, again, if anyone's interested in NLP, and you could look at hashtags to see to what extent there was differing opinions on those hashtags, how much pushback they were getting, and whether that pushback looked like it was coming from within the country or outside the country based on inferred location. That's another way to do it potentially. Yeah, there's other ways, but it's kind of a big question to deal with. But I think measuring the political stance, people do stance analysis of the dominant voices on Twitter, it would be interesting. Although if you were doing Turkey, I'm sure that would be a huge job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so next up we have Meltem raising her hand. Hello, Meltem, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing? Okay.
Good.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure out the raise hand option. It had been so long since I didn't use Zoom. Okay, first of all, thanks so much for this presentation. I am kind of hesitant to use Giphy because there are too many buttons and all that, but seeing you how you do it was really great. I'm always kind of intimidated, and I just go back to R, but the visualization is not really great. So that was perfect.
Yeah.
So I have two questions. One is more about identifying the suspicious accounts, and it was really interesting for me to see that looking at that the accounts are using web app and just targeting one particular account. That was really interesting. I'm kind of wondering whether there are any other ways of identifying suspicious accounts. Yeah, I'll just stop there because the other questions are more about the visualization part of it.
Sure, I'll just explain that one quickly. Yeah, there are, and it depends. So I think, Akin will know this one well. Let me just share my screen. 1 second. So I've got so many tabs open that this just makes sharing a huge nightmare. Anyway, okay. So what you have here, so if you look, so one of the examples I showed you was the Tawakkul Carmen Facebook Caliphate hashtag. And if we see here on the right, you see on the right, this highlighted picture, the community that I showed you as suspicious was down here. Now, I analyzed that a few anomalies. One of the anomalies was the fact that they were all engaging. It's a separate community for one, but they were all engaging in, they were all using Twitter web app in this case. But then if you take those accounts and again, look at the user creation date, what you will find often in these cases is that if you're running influence operation, many times you'll have whatever company, marketing company or troll farm, they will set up hundreds of accounts in one day. So, right, if you look at what this graph shows you is the accounts in that sample and the month or the day which those accounts were created. And obviously we know Twitter started back in 2006. So most samples will have a date range from 2006 to the present day. But as you can see here, what's the average user account created per day, per month rather, is probably 10 or 20. We can see that in July 2019 and June 2019, these huge spikes in account creation, right? And these spikes were the accounts that we deemed to be suspicious. So then we have these compounding anomalies. Not only are they all using Twitter web app, not only are they all separate, but they all happen to be created within a 2-month period, which well exceeds the kind of norm we'd expect from a normal sample of Twitter account creation dates. So that's another way that you can see those kind of potential suspicious things. And it's not always the case. This is the interesting thing about it. The more accounts I look at now that are engaging in influence campaigns are not created in the same day. They've been bought or sold. They're real accounts that have then been changed. So you can't necessarily use this method. So this is why you have to keep trying to adapt and find new methods in terms of detection. So it's a really important question. You know, and sometimes I'm trying to think actually, like I'm looking at Chinese disinformation now, and one of the things that I notice about the accounts is, again, the account creation date method doesn't work. The Twitter web app works to an extent, but for some reason, whoever set up this network must have got a hold of thousands and thousands of accounts that used to belong to people that were scrubbed. And then for some reason, they'd all tweeted 3 tweets, and all these 3 tweets were like aphorisms. They were different ones, but they were like, you know, inspirational quotes, and they were using like photos. So, you know, you can start to look at these accounts. You might do reverse image searches on the photos to see if they're stolen photos. It kind of depends, you know. Sometimes you have to do account level analysis just to sort of convince yourself that this might be a troll or a bot. I did I don't know if you remember, a few months ago after the re-invasion of Ukraine, there was a hashtag called I Stand With Putin. So this was suddenly out of nowhere, all this support for Putin, which obviously seemed kind of strange at the time. And I analyzed the hashtag, and what you could see, there was a very, very active community. It didn't necessarily adhere to these rules of obvious anomalies in terms of what application was being used or creation date. But what I did notice when I clicked on the most influential accounts was that some of them were really old, like they'd been created in 2014, right? But they only had 20 tweets. And suddenly, like 2 of the tweets that they did have had thousands and thousands of retweets, right? So why is this the case? It's suspicious. It's not a smoking gun. You can't with any certainty say this is fake, but already that's suspicious. And then you look at another account in that sample, and it has the same pattern. It's also a very old account with a few tweets. Yeah, a lot of the tweets it does have suddenly seem to have a lot of retweets and a lot of engagement. So all these things can actually, it's a lot like detective work, you know. Sometimes the network analysis just enables you to zone in on a particular spot that you can inspect a bit more. And sometimes when you have the ones I've shown you ones that are like GIFs, you know, it's like, oh my God, this is like, you know, shooting fish in a barrel, as they say. But the reason I wanted to show these ones too, these quote unquote obvious ones, is again, it shows the deficiencies of Twitter's ability to actually combat this, right? Because if I, a human, can actually detect this in fairly straightforward terms, then when Twitter say that if it's computational propaganda or something, that they've got a handle on it, I know that they're not telling the full truth. So there's some more examples, but there are more different things, and it depends on the network. Sometimes tweet synchronicity, you know, all sorts of things, like a community, the Chinese network I mentioned, if you actually look at the accounts, you'll notice that they almost have the same number of following and followers, right? Which is like the follow back networks. And so, you know, I guess from a programming perspective, you could look at it as a ratio. If the ratio of following to followers approximates 1, then it's more likely to be suspicious as well. So you could build that into it. But it depends on the network. You know, there's so many different things, or huge amounts of tweets. Sometimes you see these accounts with like, you know, over 1 million tweets. It's like, who the hell can do that if it's not suspicious? So yeah, there's lots of red flags, you know, and it's a really important question, and it changes. And sometimes you'll look at a network with your existing knowledge and think, I can't see anything suspicious here, and then you find something that is new and gives you another insight. Sorry, I went on a bit, but thank you.
No, that's really useful, because no, this is actually the reason why it's like, even though there were like programs or like softwares or that we're looking at, bots or all those kind of stuff, like there was more the kind of like whether those programs actually are working or not is becoming a question mark. But actually you saying that the dynamic is changing a lot, because basically the communities are adapting to those, like people who are doing these campaigns are adapting to those, is a really, really good answer to this. And like I think it really would be useful to just like see the patterns, like automate those, like see what kind of characteristics these accounts have. But that's really useful. Thank you. Thanks so much.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I also remember, like with the I Stand With Putin hashtag, I think The Economist had a new report came out like a couple days ago.
Yes, that was based on that, because I think I was the first person to analyze that hashtag, and then there was another private corporation that did an analysis that was based on linguistic patterns. I can't remember the exact arguments. I remember at the time when it was tweeted about, but it was initially the person who had done it had tried to make a claim that had been rebuffed, because again, when it comes to making these analyses, one has to be careful about the things it can actually tell us in terms of making a claim. I think the I standard Putin one, what you noticed is that locationally, if you analyze just the user input location, I found that the majority of accounts in India, also Africa and Kenya. But the way it was initially framed by the researcher was that Russian disinformation operations in these languages are going, like, we don't know that there's Russian disinformation operations in those languages, right? We know that there's a bunch of Twitter accounts with people who report the data in that location saying these things. We don't know anything about coordination or anything like that, right? But I think, in my experience, there's always pressure from journalists in particular to get the smoking gun. They want to know who's behind it. But most time we don't. We can hypothesize who might be behind this, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous to say that maybe there are people. There's a lot of people in South Africa who, support Putin, or same with India, right? Or maybe in India, Modi knows that he can't have people being sympathetic to Ukraine because they'll go out on the streets, and then he has to put pressure on him to criticize Putin, and he doesn't want that. So maybe the BJP really are strongly trying to influence people's thought diet through social media operations. These are all hypotheses, but we can't prove it. So I think there's always that desire to find the Russian disinformation. In my new book, actually, I have a subheading called "It's Not Always the Russians," except when it is.
Thanks so much.
It is sometimes, and that's right.
Okay. So Madam, do you have any other questions or?
Yes, I'll just very briefly ask, like, you were using Force Atlas 2 for visualizing the, like separating, and also using the modularity class to find the clusters. I'm curious why you're using those methods apart instead of like others. Like when it comes to clustering, there's Leiden, there's like all the other options listed. So I'm just curious why you're using those two.
Yeah. So for the cluster, for the sort of layout algorithm, Force Atlas 2, over time, it's a practical thing in many ways. Force Atlas 2 gives me a graph that's not too big, but sufficiently readable, with sufficient spacing between the nodes. And that to me is legible. Like, you can use the other ones, and by all means do, but sometimes it's a practical thing. Sometimes one node will cover the other node, and you can't stop that from happening. So people can't see all the data as it is. Or some will have some create the layout based on they sort of normalize the edges in the sense that every edge will then become an equal length to create this kind of symmetrical graph, and that doesn't necessarily give you indications about power relationships or asymmetries. So for example, when I showed you that really distinct cluster off the graph, some of the algorithms wouldn't show that immediately. So for me, Force Atlas 2, it provides immediacy. Modularity class, up until now, it was the only community detection one that Gephi used. Now they have statistical inference, which is apparently more accurate. But the thing with modularity class, it allows you to change the threshold slightly. So what's interesting about that, I think I showed briefly the example how I changed the threshold on the modularity to make it less parsimonious when it was determining the networks. What's good about that is I deemed that separate part to be suspicious. However, it was two different communities. So I expanded the threshold, created one community. And then when I exported that, it allowed me to filter for one single community rather than two to do further analysis on those tweets. So there are like some practical considerations, but frankly, I mean, it's always worth exploring new forms of community detection, when it comes to things. It's just, for a while, that was the only one available. And to me, it still allows a degree of flexibility.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Great. So we have some participants typing their questions. So I'm basically going to pitch them over to you one by one. So Ömer Naim Küçük asks, thanks for the great talk. Could you briefly inform us about measures of relatedness in network analysis? You kind of did this. I think what he's asking is, can you maybe show us additional measures except the ones that you already talked about? How can we know whether nodes with particular qualities are systematically related to other nodes, and how can we quantify this relationship? You kind of already did, so like retweets count, like count, quote retweet count, maybe like shared followers. But can we maybe like think of like infrequently used measures to maybe create new relationships, do you think?
When you say infrequently used, could you just elaborate, for example?
So the frequent ones that we use are, follower networks, maybe follower convergence ones to basically, generate common followers, retweets, frequency of retweets. What can we be missing in terms of, getting other maybe alternative measures of relatedness in a network?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned some, but another example that you tend to see with CUDA-bot networks is temporalness, right? You'll see rapid activity in quick succession, right? So you'll see a retweet network if it's bots often will suddenly if you did a time analysis of the hashtag, you'd see suddenly a spike within a 1 minute period where the retweets have all taken place. I saw this a lot when I was looking at the coup in Tunisia, is that a lot of the networks bolstering these anti-Muslim Brotherhood tweets about the coup were suddenly spiking, which was interesting. There's also, if you factor in two more of the analysis, for example, in addition to the source, what application was used, it's the chronology of the source. So what you might find, I found in some networks in Kuwait, for example, you might have a particular application is used and you'll see it start off a trend. So a trend starts with accounts, primarily just using, say, TweetDeck. And then it breaks out and becomes organic, it becomes a mishmash. You wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that from a graph, but if you lay out the temporal time of the hashtag over the source, you can see that the suspicion is not just in the source, but it's in the fact that the source using these particular applications existed right at the beginning and only the beginning. So there's different ways of interpreting it. It's not just about those one things, it's about seeing them holistically, how they operate together. There's, even if you're looking at the content of the tweet, I even actually found a video software explaining, the video explainer for the software of about a guy who creates bot accounts. But what he did in this software, which was quite crude, was to include a random string. There was an option to include a random string of characters in the tweet. The idea was this would confuse Twitter's algorithm because it would make the tweet seem more unique. But what you see was all these tweets from accounts that had diverse sources, these different things, but that they all had this 3-letter string within the actual content of the tweet. Even the maximum name of the account, I've seen networks that the suspicious entity was the fact that they maxed out the username. So the username was obviously automatically generated, but it was generated in such that I think it's 14 or 15 characters, which is the maximum Twitter can use, that all the accounts in that network had that maximum thing, and they were all tweeting the same thing. So there are different indicators for sure. And often you'll have to look at a network and sort of work backwards, all these different things together. I always imagine if there was some portal where you popped in a hashtag and sort of said, please analyze this to see if it's fake, you'd have a string of different checkboxes on the right to apply the different heuristics to go through this, because you might find that some would just not detect suspicious activity on those things. And remember this, when we're talking about suspicious activity, it's not just, it's often bots, but it's not always bots. It can be trolls, because trolls could be detected by, for example, using the same source app. But automation is different from finding troll networks. And obviously, political analysis is different. We could talk about as how to analyze information without looking for influence campaigns. But I think influence campaigns is probably the most interesting. Anyway, I rambled again. Sorry.
No. Thank you so much. So we have next question, Saadettin Demiral. Hi, this must be a beginner level question, but I'm curious about Marc's takes on it. Is it possible to predict or know political alignments of Twitter users with following and followers lists we retrieve from Twitter API with social network analysis, and how reliable is it? So I added a link that Emre typed before this question. So it's Pablo Barbera's article on Twitter ideology detection, which is one of the articles that kind of answer this question extensively. But what is your take? How reliable are follower and following lists in terms of getting a sense of political alignment?
I think it's a good question. It's not a beginner level question at all. I think it's an enduring question. I think the big question here is one, the reason this research is always important is firstly, when we're looking at this, we have to actually know that who we're looking at are even real people. Because what you tend to find, like when I look at these Chinese networks, you have like follow back mega networks, right? So people follow each other back. It's the whole point of the network. I follow you as a pro-Trump supporter, and then you follow me back. So what this does is amplify these kind of follow networks. So you get very dense, with very close ratios of following to follow of people who would be ideologically similar. So I think they can be very important in some contexts. I think when you have activism around a particular topic, then they will be indicative. But I also think there's barometers. So I've done some research. So the graph you see, for example, I do something similar. It's not quite on following networks, but if you look here, you'll see this network graph that shows two distinct communities, right? The analysis that this was based on was, I don't know how many of you followed the case, but there was a British Iranian woman called Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe who was imprisoned in Iran for, I think, about 6 years. She's a British citizen, but she was imprisoned and essentially held hostage until the British paid a debt that they owed Iran from the 70s. But what happened was she was released earlier this year. This was a few weeks ago, actually. And she was critical of the government, right? So she did the usual. She came out of prison, she landed in the UK, she met her family, and then she, had a press conference, and she was critical of the government. And suddenly what happened on Twitter, there was this hashtag called ungrateful cow. And for those of you who aren't familiar, cow is a very derogatory term in British English. You call someone a cow, usually reserved for women. So there was this hashtag literally criticizing this woman who'd missed most of her daughter growing up, who had been in Iranian prison for 6 years because she criticized the government. So it was a really interesting example to analyze. So I analyzed it. And what I found, just by looking at the hashtag ungrateful cow, I got this very distinctly polarized community. So I thought, I could hypothesize based on what I'd already seen, what I was going to find, but my hypothesis played out. Rather than looking at the follower networks, which is also valuable, I do this with a lot of hashtags. I copied all the bios, all the biographical data from the users in group 2 and group 1. And then I just ran them through the AntConc, which is a corpus checker, which will just count the most frequent words in those bios. And what I found was that the people who were using ungrateful cow to criticize Nazanin, the most common biographical descriptor that they had was Brexit and pro-Boris Johnson. So they were basically right-wing Brexit supporters. Whereas those who were criticizing the hashtag, saying this is really problematic, were most likely to be pro-Brexit. They had pro-Brexit in their bio, and also being pro-Labour or love Labour. So there's two things here. You can, based on these, see polarization and analyze it based on biographies. I just have this ingrained suspicion when I see accounts that it's just amazing to me that the most popular word in both these sets of accounts were actually related to Brexit, which is not necessarily uncommon in the UK. I've been so exposed to so much deception online that if someone doesn't have a verifiable identity, yet they have a political activist account, I'm never convinced they're real. So when it comes to looking at follower networks, I always have that question in the back of my mind: how do you know you're dealing with real people? So that's my big reservation. But in theory, I think it's a useful barometer. But I think we need to have better management of making sure that the accounts that exist are actually real people. Because as my research has shown, and as many other people's research has shown, Twitter is a cesspit. Like, it's just, there's so much garbage out there. How do we know what we're dealing with is real?
Yeah. Cool. Do we have any other questions? Oh, by the way, Marc, do you have like a slide that maybe we can share with people somewhere? You said I have slides about what?
Oh, I just have slides. I was showing you some just the ones I've been sort of showing about some data visualization.
Oh, these ones. Okay.
Yeah. So this is just a quick example of.
Yeah.
I colored the edges here by the language using Twitter API data. And then you could, for example, see what are English people talking about, what are Spanish. But I have data sets. So if people are interested in training, the 2 examples I showed, the walkthroughs, I have the data. So people could then, if they were going through the recorded video, try to replicate those steps using the data if they wanted to get to grips with Gephi. So I'm happy to share that if that's of interest.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, people can maybe email you, because I assume not everyone is going to replicate it. But those of you who want to actually do a replication of this study, code through style by watching this video, feel free to email Marc, and you can go from there. So any other questions? I'm just checking in case I'm missing something. It seems no. Marc, thank you so much. This has been really great. Let me find my clap emoji. Okay, that's my clap emoji. Thank you so much.
Emoji.
This has been like wonderful. Political network analysis is a huge topic for us, not just in Turkey, but I think pretty much it's a global kind of focus of interest. Thank you so much for doing this. And I'm pretty sure people are going to get in touch with you about data, about how to get better with network analysis, because this was particularly important for us. When we say Twitter analysis, we tend to think only R or Python, but you don't need them. I mean, they're good, of course, but you can actually use other, maybe like simpler in terms of like, you don't need to do coding knowledge maybe, but you can actually learn how to use Gephi, you can learn how to use Node Excel. Actually, even people who use R tend to use Gephi for network analysis, because in R it's like trickier. But this was really helpful for us. Thank you so much, Marc.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. And obviously, as Akin said, I'm happy to answer. If people want to get in touch with the email or just have a go with the data, I'm happy to share. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, take care, guys.
Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.